Okay, so we're going to be learning today Yevamot daf nun tet. Happy Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach to everyone. Today's daf we're learning today will be in honor of the state of Israel celebrating 74 years of independence. Today's daf is also sponsored by Laura Schechter in honor of her daughter Kayla, who has won her division of the USA Chidona Tanakh 2 years in a row, is now under spot to compete in next year's international competition. Kayla, it's been such a pleasure doing our own learning side by side. Abba and I are so proud of your effort and accomplishments. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. Today's stuff is also sponsored by Tina and Shalom Lamb with gratitude to Hashem for a grand new granddaughter, Sophia Miriam. Mazal tov to her parents, Sarah and Shmuel Lamb. And today's stuff is sponsored by the Hadron Zoom community in honor of Medina Korn's birthday. We would like to wish you a happy birthday and many more till Ad Mea V'Yesrim. Thank you for all the hard work you have done for our Hadron community and for filling in with the group Zoom when Michelle records in advance. Happy birthday. Okay, we are now going to get started with the bottom of Nun Chet Amud Bet. Okay, we will have a quote from the Mishna. I'll just quickly review the Mishna. The Mishna was on Daf Nun Vav Amud Bet. It said, Almana kohen gadol, grusha b'chalutza kohen idiot mina erusin lo yochlu b'truma. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon machshirin. We already spent a long time dealing with that machloket about whether the erusin determines that she's already disqualified to the kohen. If she does, she's already disqualified for kahuna, meaning she can no longer eat truma. And if they were then, though, subsequently, so there's a machloket whether the erusin itself ruins her from eating truma. Let's say she's a bat kohen. But nit'almalu or nitgarshu min ha'nisu'im psulot min ha'erusin shira. But if they in the end ended up getting divorced from the erusin, or the husband died in the erusin, and she never ends up, right? The whole problem was, remember, she was mishtameret lebi'apsula. She was kind of ready to do bi'apsula, but she never did, because in the end, the marriage never happened. So if the marriage in the end never happens, then everyone agrees that she's not disqualified from, right, eating truma. And also, we're going to see in a minute, in 2 minutes, that they also seem to imply whether she's also disqualified from marrying a kohen in the future. Okay, so and we'll see that she's already disqualified. Anyway, forget that. We'll go back to that in a minute. So now the Mishnah says, the Gemara quotes, we're now quoting that last part. Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef Mishmor. Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef asked Shmuel the following question. Kohen gadol shekidesh taktana. I should stop for a minute and just say, we're going to get to this machloket soon in the next Mishnah, which is coming up very shortly, that not only can a Kohen gadol not marry an almana, a widow, and anyone else who the regular Kohen couldn't marry, he also needs to marry a betula. Now, a betula means someone who hasn't had relations with anyone else before. So the question is going to be, right, she has to be what we would call a virgin, right, as someone who hasn't had intercourse with anyone yet. But we're going to see that this definition is very broadened, what comes under betula. And in fact, we're going to see that to some people, it's an age thing, okay, meaning there's 3 stages for women in their development that the Gemara talks about. There's a ketana, which is a woman under the age of 12 and hasn't yet had 2 pubic hairs. Then after that, there's a na'ara, which is kind of a 6-month stage after that. For the first 6 months of being, of coming to maturity, as they say, she's considered a na'ara. It's an in-between stage. This comes up in all sorts of halachic areas. And then she becomes a bogeret after those 6 months have passed. So according to some opinions, a kohen gadol can't marry a bogeret. That a bogeret is already considered not in the category of a betula, right? A betula, according to this, doesn't have only to do with, okay, I shouldn't say it doesn't have anything to do with what we would consider a virgin or not. It also has to do with that. Let's say she's under that age and has relations with someone, she's disqualified for marrying a kohen gadol. But when she gets to a certain age, she's already disqualified as well. So his pool is very limited in terms of who he can marry, right? Because now not only have we limited all sorts of other things, but now there's an age range as well. And she can only be, right, which to us sounds absurd, right? You can only betroth someone who's, right, and we'll see, not only betrothal, maybe even marriage, she has to be under 12 and basically 12 and a half, okay, in order to be able to marry her, which already really limits the pool. Although you have to remember, in those days, it seems people did get married at younger ages. So now Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef asked Shmuel the following question. Kohen gadol, so assuming that we hold, again, this is assumption, it's not the only opinion, but assuming we hold that he can't marry someone who's called a bogeret, this 12 years plus 2 pubic hairs, then add 6 months, okay? He can't marry her if she's beyond that. What if kidesha taktana? he betrothed her when she was still of age, younger. Ubagra tachtav, but until they did the marriage, then there's no age limit for a kohen. This is only true for a kohen gadol. And then bagra tachtav, she became of age while she was engaged to him. Mau batar nisuin azlina or batar elusin azlina. What's the issue? It says hu isha betula yikach. This is a pasuk we're going to darshan a lot today. He has to marry a woman who has her betulim. Yikach. Yikach is the word used for marriage, but marriage, betrothal, the question is which one? So is it that she has to be a betula at the time of kiddushin, the engagement, or at the time of the marriage? So if she was of right age at the time of the kiddushin, but wasn't at the time of the marriage, can he go ahead with it or not? So Amar Le, Shmuel answers him, Tani Tua, we can learn it from our Mishna. Nit armelu, o nit garshu, mina nisuim psulot, mina elusim ksherot. If, right, what's the cutoff thing in the Mishnah? It's all about were they actually married or not were they engaged. If she was engaged, right, and then she became an almanah because, right, she was engaged to someone, and then he died. If he died, right, even though maybe according to some opinions the erusin already disqualifies her, but in the end, right, if she was an almanah and then, or nidgarsha, and then she but she never ended, and the whole question was, right, did she end up marrying the kohen gadol in the end? Or did she marry the kohen in the grusha case? So again, if the marriage never went through and he died first or divorced her first, then she's ksherot, right? They can eat truma. So what do you see here? You see that it's all about marriage is the moment. So therefore, it should be forbidden if she became of age, too old before the marriage happened. Amar le, Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef doesn't like this answer. He says, "L'shavuya chalala lo kemebayali debiuhi to mishavya chalala." That's all about. Again, it's about disqualifying her from truma, but it's about, is she doing this marriage? It's a forbidden marriage. It's all about the halala, right? About making children halalim. That whole thing about not marrying a widow or a divorcee, that's all about, if you do, you'll make your child a halal, right? So then that's all about bi'ah, because it all has to do with your children. What's going to happen to your children down the road? So that's all dependent, therefore, on marriage, which has bi'ah, intercourse, which is going to mess up your children. But here, here I'm trying to figure out the meaning of this verse. He has to take, right? The word take, what does take mean? He has to take a woman who's a betula. When is the taking? Is the taking at the erusin or is the taking at the nisuin? So that's not very clear. In other words, you're comparing two things that are very different. So he tries a second attempt. Amar le, so Shmuel thinks further and says, ha'nami tani tua. We can find it from another Mishnah in our chapter, a Mishnah we haven't seen yet. We're going to see on Daf Samach Aleph in 2 dapim. E'raseta almana v'nitmana liot kohen gadol yichnos. If he betrothed his almana, a widow, and then he's a kohen ragil, a normal kohen. A normal kohen is allowed to marry a widow. What if in the interim he becomes the kohen gadol? Okay, what if before the marriage he becomes a kohen gadol? What does the Mishnah say? Yichnos, he's allowed to marry her. So what do you see here? The opposite of what Shmuel was trying to prove before. Shmuel now proves, it's all about the time of the erusin, the engagement. Because here you see, she was disqualified to him at the time of the marriage. She was a widow, and he was a kohen gadol at that point. In fact, they're even going to tell a story about Yeshua ben Gamla. It's already up on our site. Shuli Mishka wrote an article about, from a history perspective of this union between Yeshua ben Gamla and Marta Bapaitus. And it's all about, the stories about the Kohanim Gedolim buying their way into the Kuna Gdolah. So anyway, what do you see here? It's all about, he can marry her. So it's all about the time of Kiddushin that's important. So they say, no, Shane Hatam, here the Gemara rejects it. It says, no, that's different. Yikach Isha. It says, Yikach Isha. Now, what is this? This is in the next verse. It says, Almana ugrusha v'chalala zona. Okay, this is the list of who a kohen gadol can't marry. Et ele lo yikach, ki im betula mi'imav yikach isha. Okay, even though the pasuk before it just said he isha betula yikach, he has to marry a woman who's a virgin. Here it says it again, you can't marry these women because you need to marry a betula. And it says, ki im betula mi'imav yikach isha. could have just said betula yikach. It doesn't need to say a woman. Obviously, we're talking about women. These are all lists of women. So the extra word woman comes to teach you that it includes another woman that you might not have thought you could marry. Who's that? If she was an almana and you were a kohen ragil at the time of kiddushin, then at the time of marriage, you're allowed to marry her even if you became a kohen gadol in the interim. So that word isha at the end of pasuk yud daled, we're in chapter 21 of Vayikra, verse 14. That isha comes to include an additional case, because why else would the word be there? So that includes that case is permitted. But you can't learn from there to our case, which again is someone who was a ktana at the time of the kiddushin, but now is already a gdola at the time of the marriage. So that word isha is coming for one thing. It teaches that and not this. Well, the Gemara asks against that. Hachanami ktiv isha. What do you mean? Our pasuk also, verse 13 there said, Vihu isha betula yikach. Why wouldn't it just say Vihu yikach betula, or however you want to say it? But you wouldn't need the word isha. If you're going to say the word isha in pasuk 14 comes to include an additional case and permit something, why don't we say it permits our case as well? To which the Gemara answers echat velo shtayim. Echat velo shtayim is very interesting. It's not clear exactly what it means. Most commentaries explain echat velo shtayim. Rashi says, "Achat yesh lecha l'rabot velo shtayim." In other words, the word isha appears in 13, the word isha appears in 14. You can only darshan one of them. Why you can only darshan one of them is a good question. Theoretically, it seems like you should be able to darshan each of them. Maybe you say one is needed to actually, for its own sake, to say isha, and therefore the second one is this. Unclear exactly. The Rambam actually has a very different explanation, which includes another limitation on the kohen gadol. He actually says each isha is needed for a drasha. The second one for the drasha we just said, to include that case that was mentioned in the Mishna on Samach Aleph. The first isha is to tell you he can only, hu isha betula yikach means only one woman and not two women, because it says isha and not nashim, not in plural. So according to the Rambam, a kohen gadol can't marry two wives, and that's what he learns from here. So it's very important to know how you darshan this about whether the kohen gadol could actually marry two women or not. Okay, in any case, it's not clear. We're going to move on. Now, let's just assume in any case, one isha is for echat velo shtayim maybe, or you can't darshan it at all. The other one was to teach us this halacha in the Mishna further on, that again, if you betrothed her in a way that was totally permitted, she was a widow, but you were a regular kohen, in interim you became a kohen gadol, you actually could go ahead with the marriage. But it doesn't come to teach us anything about this question that Rabbi Chiya Rav Yosef asked. Doesn't teach us about a kohen gadol that betrothed us a minor, and then she became too old by the time the marriage happened. So the obvious question is maraita. If you're going to say we darshan one and not the other, why that one and not this one? To which they answer, ha ishtane gufa v'ha lo ishtane gufa. In the first case, our case, what happened? She changed. Her body changed, right? She's now no longer a betula. So at the time of marriage, she's not a betula. It's a problem. In the other case, his status changed, but nothing changed in her. She was the exact same person, right? Here, again, she's obviously the same person too, but they view her as she crossed over into a different stage. And that already makes him not permitted to marry her. Whereas when she was the almanah and he was a regular kohen, that was fine. So she stayed the same. So therefore, he can go ahead with the marriage because her status hasn't changed at all. It was only his status that changed, and that doesn't forbid him to marry. Again, one could argue maybe otherwise, but that's the Gemara's answer, because again, the Gemara is coming from the perspective of we know this and we don't know that. So that's clearly the drasha, and this isn't. So let's try to come up with a logic that can explain it, or at least distinguish between the cases, and that distinction must be the reason. Okay, new Mishna. Kohen gadol lo yisa almana bein almana min ha'erusin bein almana min ha'nisuin. A kohen gadol can't marry any kind of widow. It doesn't matter whether she was widowed from betrothal, she'd only been engaged and never married, or widowed from marriage. Soon we'll see where they get this from, right? In classic Mishna style, they don't tell you the source. V'lo yisata bogeret. This is what we said a few minutes ago, that he can't marry someone who's 12 with 2 pubic hairs and then another 6 months. Right? Only beyond that, he can't marry. Up until that stage, he can. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon machshirim bebogeret. Again, we're going to have this machloket between Tanakama, who's going to be Rabbi Meir, we're going to see later, and Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, same as they had machloket in the previous Mishna here also. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say there's no age limit. Okay, all has to do with betulim or not betulim. Okay, is she a virgin? Is she not a virgin? Nothing about this age. Below Yisa, there's words in brackets now, which seem to have not appeared in certain texts of the Mishnah, but whoever put this together seems to think this should appear in the Mishnah. Below Yisat mukat eitz. He also can't marry a woman who tore her hymen from an accident or something else happened, right? She was hit by, something injured her inside that tore her hymen. So she doesn't have her virginity, which really is right. Her hymen is not intact or is torn. So she's also excluded from marrying a kohen gadol because he needs betula. She actually has to be a betula, which is surprising. And maybe that's why some people didn't have this in their Mishnah. It's a little surprising because you would assume she has to be a virgin from not having had relations with someone. Today, we're going to learn all sorts of things about that. What else is considered her not to be a virgin, not only having relations with someone? The Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, Almana lo yikach. Now we're back to this Almana, Be'emena nisuin, Be'emena erusin. Be'en amana erusin, Be'en amana nisuin, either which way. So the braita proves it from the text. The braita is like a midrash halakha style, where instead of the Mishnah just states it, they connect it to a verse. Almana lo yikach, don't take an almana, right? So almana, it didn't say what type of almana. It must include all widows also from engagement. So the Gemara says, pshita, obviously. They say, well, it's not necessarily so obvious. Where do you see an almana in the Torah? Tamar, right, the whole famous Yudan Tamar story, she was married to his sons, and then he didn't want to do Yevamot with the third son because his other sons died. She is called an almana in the pasuk. So because she's called an almana, it says here, Yehuda says to Tamar, Shvi almana beit avich ad yidal shela beni. Now she was married to them. She wasn't just betrothed to them. So the case that you see in the Torah of a real almana, a real life almana, was someone who was married. So maybe you would think that almana is only that. This is similar to the drasha we did about the brothers. Achim and Achim, we learned from the Achim of Yosef, were 12 brothers, and therefore brothers from the father and not from the mother. So here we do the same. You might have thought that. You might have thought that it's only for marriage. That's why the Mishna has to tell you we don't learn it from there. Don't think that it's only almana like Tamar. No, it's even an almana from engagement. They say, what? Maybe we should learn it from Tamar. Maybe it makes more sense to say that. They say, well, dumia de grusha. No, because almana is mentioned next to a grusha. Now, what's a grusha? It's someone who got a get. And when do you get a get? You can get a get from engagement. Remember, once you're betrothed, you need a get to get out of it. Just like we saw ma'amar, you need a get to get out of it, right? So, dumia de grusha, ma grusha be'emena nisuin be'emena erusin, af almana be'emena erusin be'emena nisuin. So from there, you learn an almana as well is either one. Below yisat habogeret. Now we're going to get into this machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, and we're going to have each one is going to darshan this pasuk, hu isha betula yikach, actually the word itself, bivtuleha, 3 stages, okay? 2 kind of build on the other, and the third is a little bit separate from them. They're each going to darshan, and everything they're going to darshan is opposite the other. So first we're starting with Rabbi Meir. V'hu isha bivtuleha yikach, prat lebogeret shekalu la betuleha. When it says isha bivtuleha yikach, it means it excludes a grown woman, again, which is 12 and 6 months, or 12 plus 2 pubic hairs plus 6 months, right? Beyond that is a bogeret, shekalu la betula. She no longer has her betula. Now, why we assume she's not a virgin? Again, you have to understand this word. Betula is not a virgin the way we would call it. It means her body has changed and maybe the area is widened a little bit, right? It's a little bit different. So that's already a physical change that's happened to her that no longer considers her a betula according to Torah law. That's divrei Rabbi Meir. We're not going to yet get to the drasha. In another minute, we will. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon machshirim bebogeret. They say, no, he can marry a bogeret. Betula has nothing to do with that. So now the Gemara is going to say, what's the root of their debate? Rabbi Meir savar. Now the word is bivtuleha. That has basically 3 parts of it. It could have just said betula. Instead, it said betuleha. So we're going to have 2 drashot on. First on the word betula, the root itself. Then why it says betuleha, her virginity. And then why it says bivtuleha, with her virginity. Okay, so we're going to have to understand those 3 things are going to be darshan. So betula, just the root itself, betula, would have said afilu miksat betula mashma, would have implied even if she's just a little bit of a virgin, okay, which again is going to relate to her development stages, okay, that as long as she's not fully not a virgin, we would call her a betula. But bituleha, because it adds that bituleha at the end, you would say, ad deika kola betulin. You need to be complete, okay? Meaning, once you're beyond a certain age, you're no longer a complete betula. Bivtuleha, what does that teach? This is, as I said, the third part they're going to darshan is already something different, which is bikedarka in shalo kedarka lo. Because it says bivtuleha, that extra bet comes to limit it, that it's bikedarka in, that you're going to be a betula. You're going to, actually, this is how you're going to lose your virginity. This is, by the way, the other track, right? There's a track of age, and then there's a track of actions. So if we go by the track of actions, meaning, let's say you are within the given age, according to Rabbi Meir, you're within 12 and a half, and you have relations with someone, well, what's going to mess you up? If you had typical relations, but atypical, which normally we would say that doesn't cause you to lose your virginity, well, then no, that won't be a problem. So let's just go according to Rabbi Meir. Under 12 and 6 months, only if you engage in normal sexual relations, will you, right, typical as they call them, will you be excluded from marrying a kohen gadol. Once you get to 12 and a half or 12 and 2 hairs and 6 months, beyond that, you can't marry a kohen no matter what, because already you don't have all your virginity with you because your body has changed. Now we have Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Savre, betula, they're going to darshan everything the exact opposite. Betula shlema mashma. Betula, if it had said betula, it would have sounded like complete version. But betula, afilu miktzat betulim. Because it says betula, that means any kind of betulim that she has, then she can marry the kohen gadol. So as long as she's a partial betula, meaning she's, let's say, beyond, right? She's 13 years old and she hasn't had sexual relations yet. So then she's basically a partial betula. That's fine. Okay, we don't mind that her body has changed. Bivtuleha, what does that do? Achu kol betula kayamim. Here they're more stringent and they say ben b'kedarka ben shalo kedarka. But if she had any kind of sexual interaction, then we're going to have a problem. Okay, whether it was kedarka, typical or atypical, she's not going to be considered a virgin anymore. So while on the one hand they're expanding the options by saying age is not an issue, but they limit it by saying any type of intercourse is going to be a problem. Now we're going to talk about this. We're going to have Rav, who paskins a particular way, which sounds like he also like Rabbi Elazar. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, nivala shelo kedarka psula lekuna. We're going to talk about this woman who had atypical relations. She cannot marry a kohen. We mean a kohen gadol. Okay, she can't marry a high priest because obviously nobody ever said this was an issue for a regular priest. Although we're going to raise a bit of an issue about this. Mativ Rava. Rava contradicts or questions Rav from the following source. Now we're moving into one of these difficult topics in the Torah, but again, it's one of those topics that you have to understand in a societal context, that if a man rapes a woman by Torah law, there's rape and then there's seducing. If he seduces her, meaning she was consensual about it. So, but now we're talking about rape. We'll get to the end of the daf to seducing. If he rapes a woman, it says in the Torah, I'll read you the verse, V'natana isha shochev ima lavi anara 50 kesef. He has to pay the father because of the embarrassment he caused to the woman. V'lo tieh isha, and he's supposed to marry her. Okay, you might think, what a terrible concept, but it actually is a concept to protect the woman, because the woman at this point has what's called a pagam, right? Nobody's going to want to marry her, especially in those days. If a woman was raped, that was considered a big embarrassment. They wouldn't want to marry her. Her prospects would go down, and therefore they say, well, this is what you did. Take responsibility, right? You wanted to be with her. Well, take responsibility. You have to marry her. Okay, tachad asher ina, because he's tortured her. Lo yuchal shachak kol yamav, and not only that, he's not allowed to divorce her. Now, of course, if the woman doesn't want to, then he doesn't have to marry her. So in terms of understanding it from our perspective, the woman is uninterested in marrying her rapist, she doesn't have to. But this is a way of protecting her. Okay, so now, according to this, v'lo tieh l'isha is limited though. What if the woman that the person raped is forbidden to him? Because let's say she was divorced and he's a kohen, or she was a widow and he's a kohen gadol. So b'isha ha're'uya lo, p'chat la'almana lekohen gadol, glusha b'chalutza lekohen idyot. So if a kohen gadol rapes a widow, he's not allowed to marry her because, right, he's forbidden. So, hey chidami, what exact case are we talking about? Ilema b'kedarka, if he raped her in a typical manner, well, my iria mishum almana, typically misham dehavya la beula. it should not matter that she's an almanah. Kohen gadol can never marry someone he raped. Why? Because she's now be'ula. She's not a betula anymore. Even though he's the one who caused her to lose her virginity, she's no longer a virgin, and he is not allowed to marry someone who's not a virgin. So it wouldn't matter if she's an almanah kohen gadol. It would be anybody, right? Not because she's a widow. It's because he already had relations with her, and therefore they assume elalav shelo kedarka. It must be that he raped her shelo kedarka. So she didn't lose her virginity. Umishum amana'in, mishum be'ulalo. And that's why it specifically says if she was an almanah, it would be a problem, but not because he had relations with her. So what do you see here? That bi'ah shelo kedarka, atypical intercourse, does not prohibit her from marrying a kohen. And what did Rav say for a kohen gadol? And what did Rav say? It does prohibit her from marrying a kohen gadol. So there seems to be a contradiction. So now they say, this is no contradiction. Hamane, Rabbi Meir, V'Rav Damar Rabbi Elazar. We have a machloket about this. Is bia shelo kedarka? Does it disqualify her or not disqualify her? So we just say very simply, Rav can disagree with this braita because the braita holds like Rabbi Meir, that it's not a problem. And that's why only if she's an almanah is it going to be a problem. And Rav holds like Rabbi Elazar, who says bi'asha, right? And Rabbi Shimon also, but Rabbi Elazar, they say right now, and who holds that bi'asha lo kedarka disqualifies her from marrying a kohen gadol. And that resolves the issue. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that Rabbi Elazar says something else as well. Something that we're going to get to on Daf Samach Aleph also, which is, what's the definition of a zona? Now remember, a kohen gadol can't marry an almanah, grusha, zona, halala, right? And he has to marry a betula. A regular kohen can't marry a grusha, a halala, and a zona. Now, what's a zona? So there's a lot of different interpretations. We're going to get to all of them in Samach Aleph. But Rabbi Elazar, if you want to say that Rav holds like Rabbi Elazar, and bi'ah shelo kedarka disqualifies her from a kohen gadol, well, Rabbi Elazar, my area mishum be'ula. Typically, dahavya la zona. It shouldn't only be because she's be'ula. A woman who engaged in sexual relations with somebody else, according to Rabbi Elazar, if you engage in sexual relations with a random person before marriage, or obviously within marriage, that would for sure be a zona, but even outside of marriage would already make you a zona. Because we'll see, Hama Rabbi Elazar, panoi habala pnuya shelo l'shem ishut. If a single man has sexual relations with a single woman, okay, not for the purposes of marriage, that makes the woman a zona, and no kohen can marry her. So anyone who's we don't hold this way, and the Gemara even says we don't hold this way, but according to Rabbi Elazar, and that's what we're trying to say, Rav holds like, no kohen can marry this woman. Okay, so again, Rabbi Elazar says bi'ah shelo kedarka is the same really as atypical intercourse, is the same as regular. Then, even though it doesn't make her lose her virginity, right? So now we're going to say that when Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, nivala shelo kedarka psula l'kiuna, and everyone is clear that kiuna means kiuna gedola. If you're going to say it's because he holds like Rabbi Elazar, and that resolved the contradiction with the braita, because the braita holds like Rabbi Meir, well, if he holds like Rabbi Elazar, he has to be consistent within Rabbi Elazar. And Rabbi Elazar said that once she has relations with anybody, she's already a zona, and no kohen can marry her. So according to that, nivala shelo kedarka would be psula to every kohen. And even though Rav in the wording didn't specify kohen gadol, everyone assumed he was talking about a kohen gadol. So therefore, you can't answer that way. So we're going to have two other answers. Rav Yosef, kigon shenivala lebeima. In other words, what do we have to do? We have to find a case where she engaged in intercourse, shelo kedarka, okay, which again means anal intercourse, and she's not a zona. So how can we have that according to Rabbi Elazar? In other words, we still want to stick with, because that's the easiest answer, that the Rav holds like Rabbi Elazar, and the braita holds like Rabbi Meir. But then you have to find a case where she's not a zona, because then she'd be forbidden to a kohen as well. And that's not what Rav said. So Rabbi Yosef says, if she engaged in bestiality, which I know sounds very strange, but in those days, by the way, it was somewhat rampant in the Roman culture, okay, where people were doing things with animals, okay? Nowadays, it's incredibly uncommon, but Rabbi Yosef says that was the case. And then we're going to say, you're not considered a zona if you engage in bestiality, okay, sexual relations with an animal. And then we found a case where she's be'ula. She had niv'ala shelo kedarka to an animal. And that's why she's forbidden to a kohen gadol, because she's no longer considered a betula because she did engage in bia shelo kedarka. That's only according to Rabbi Elazar, and that's Rav, right? But she's not a zona, and that's why it's only forbidden to a kohen gadol. But Amrle Abaye doesn't like this. He says, Mima nafshach, I be'ula havia zona nami havia, I zona lo havia, be'ula nami lo havia. Bestiality is an act of sexual relations, and therefore it should be either if you're going to call her be'ula, then you're going to say she's a zona. And if you're not going to call her be'ula, you're not going to say it's as if, right, she's not a virgin anymore. Well, then it's not a zona. Those things should go hand in hand. The chitema, and if you want to suggest maybe engaging in bestiality is dehavik amukat et shelo kedarka, it's like getting injured with a stick or something in anally, and that's going to cause a woman to become non-virgin, okay? Because it's not znut, basically, right? No one would say a mukat etz is znut, right? She's not a zona. So if you want to view bestiality like that, and then you're going to say, and then you'd have to say that mukat etz shelo kedarka would be forbidden to a kohen gadol. Well, we don't want to say that because and then if you don't say that, you basically are saying she's a zona, and then she'd be forbidden to a kohen as well. So why don't we say that? Kind of funny line. There'll be no one who can marry a kohen gadol. Why? Tzror is a small stone. If you remember from Masechet Shabbat, we learned that they use stones to wipe themselves in the bathroom. So basically, you're going to say all women are mukat eitz, basically shelo kedarka, because they wipe themselves in the bathroom, which means if you're going to consider that a problem, that she's no longer a virgin, there's going to be no woman who can ever marry a kohen gadol. We definitely don't want to get to the point where we've limited to women who don't wipe themselves in the bathroom, right? That would be kind of odd. So that answer is not a good answer because, again, it goes back to saying basically if we don't view, again, we're talking about bestiality, shelo kedarka. We want to find a case, we're going to say that's a case where she's be'ula, but not a zona, because that's what we're looking for. But you can't say that because then she'd be like a mukat et shelo kedarka, and a mukat et shelo kedarka is not a problem at all, in which case we're going to have to say someone who engaged in bestiality is considered a zona as well. And then we're going to have the same problem, which is then she should be forbidden to a kohen as well, and that we don't say. So third answer, which will be our final answer, Ela amar Rabbi Zeria b'mima enet. Again, we have to find a way where the woman was allowed to have intercourse with this person. They engaged only in bia shelo kedarka, and therefore she's considered be'ula. She can't marry a kohen gadol because she did engage in sexual relations, but she's not a zona and she can marry a kohen. So a regular kohen. So how do we get this? A mima enet. Remember, mima enet is someone who does mi'un. What is mi'un? It's where the woman was betrothed in a case where she wasn't betrothed by the father. She's betrothed by the father. That's kiddushin on a doraita level, and she's fully married to him. But if the father's not in the picture, either dead or not dealing with it, and the mother or the brother betroth the sister, then what happens? She's only married on a rabbinic level. And when she becomes of age, like around 12 and is 12 and 6 months, she can say, I don't want to be married to this man at all, and leaves the marriage. So if that happened, and she was in this marriage and then left the marriage after having only engaged, because we're looking for a case of bia shelo kedarka, only engaged in anal intercourse, then she would be forbidden to a kohen gadol because we call her a be'ula, because again, this is according to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, that in bia shelo kedarka is considered that she's no longer a virgin, but she's not a zona because her relationship with this man was permitted because she was actually married to him. So she's not a zona and therefore would be permitted to a regular kohen. And now we finally found the case where Rav says, so again, we're going to explain Rav against the contradiction of Rava. Rava was according to Rabbi Meir. The bia shelo kedarka is not a problem. And that's why he mentioned specifically an almanah that was raped by a kohen and not that the woman wasn't a widow, because it's not a problem. Remember, he raped her bia shelo kedarka. And therefore, it's only a problem if she was a widow, not because Rav holds like Rabbi Meir. The bia shelo kedarka is not a problem, is not considered or not a betula. But Rav held specifically like Rabbi Elazar, and in a case of mima enet, and that's why, again, we're very much limiting this case of Rav. You'd have to say, right, only according to Rabbi Elazar, and in a case where there was miyun. Okay, and that's why she's not a zona and permitted to a regular kohen. Next. Amar of Shimi Bar Chiya nivala lebehema kshura lekehuna. Okay, if according now he holds, right, this is a psak, because we saw there was a bit of a debate about this. Nivala lebema, she'd be permitted to a kohen. Okay, if she ends up in a engaged in bestiality with any kind of animal, she'd be permitted to marry a kohen gadol. Tanya namihachi is a braita to support this. Right, kiuna again here means kohen gadol, high priest. Nivala lemisha eno ish, okay, which is obviously an animal. She had a relationship with something that's not a human. Even though this is quite serious and you get skila for it, but she's permitted to the kiuna. Now, there's two ways you could do nivala lebehema. You could do it intentionally, or it could happen accidentally, which we're going to see a case of right now. You obviously wouldn't get skila if it happened accidentally, right? The animal inserts itself into you. Okay, again, it's a little weird to imagine, but we're going to have a bit of a strange story about this. Ki'ata Rav Dimi, where Rav Dimi came from Israel, Amar Ma'aseh b'riba achat. He said there was a case with a young woman, that's a riba achat, a young woman. Behetlu, that's the name of a place. Shahaita mechabedet et habayit, she was sweeping the house. Ureva'a kelev kufli me'achoreha. B'chshira Rebbe l'kiuna. Okay, she ended up, okay, what we seem to be talking about is bestiality, shelo kedarka. Okay, so she ended up, this dog, while she was sweeping the floor, came in and the dog inserted himself into her, and Rebbe said she's permitted to marry a kohen. And Amar Shmuel uli kohen gadol. Okay, says not only a kohen, but even to a high priest. So Shmuel basically says that when Rebbe permitted her to a kohen, what he meant was a kohen gadol, meaning again, bi'ashalo kedarka, with an animal does not prohibit you from marrying a kohen gadol. You're still considered a betula. So now they ask a question on this. Wait a minute. When did Rebbe live? Remember, Rebbe puts together the Mishna in the year 200. So he lived, a little before that, a little bit after that. Anyway, he certainly wasn't alive when there was a temple, which was destroyed in 70. So why would he be permitting her to a kohen gadol? There was no kohen gadol once the temple was destroyed. So that's the Gemara's question. Be made Rebbe kohen gadol mihava? Was there a kohen gadol? Ela ruya le kohen gadol. What he wanted to say is, we don't consider this anything, right? Even if it was a kohen gadol. Okay, even if there was a kohen gadol around. Amale Rava miparking le Rav Ashi. Minaha milta da'amu Rabbanan ein znut lebehema. Where do we get this from? That engaged in a bestiality does not make the woman a zona. So they're going to learn it from the following pasuk. Dichtiv lo tavi et nan zona umechir kelev. First, let's explain the pasuk, and then we're going to see the Mishna on this pasuk. You can't bring a gift of a prostitute, meaning if a prostitute got money for prostitution and brought it to the temple to buy a sacrifice, that's despicable. The Torah says, okay, it says, Ki toavat Hashem Elokecha gam shnehem. These two things, which we're going to talk about right now, one is the gift a prostitute receives for her services. That's disgusting to bring to the temple. And mechir kelev, if you sold your dog, a dog was considered also very despicable in the times of the Torah. And also in the times of the Gemara, we see it many times. If you sold a dog, the price you got for the dog is also not allowed, right? The money can't be used to buy a sacrifice. Those two things are considered despicable. Utnan says in the Mishna, etnan kelev u'mechir zona mutarim. But if you flip them and you say the kelev with the etnan, which we'll explain in a minute what this means, and the mechir zona, if you flip it, they'll both be, those are permitted. How do we know? Because of a drasha on the pasuk. It says, as I said before, Ki toavat Hashem Elokecha. It's despicable to God. Gam shnehem. These two. Why did it say gam shnehem? It's to say gam shnehem shnayim below arba. Only two and not four. Meaning, don't make other permutations of these two things. So, what would an etnan kelev be? So, there's different interpretations. I'll go with one, which is if you. Well, I'll tell you both, really. You could sell your dog to prostitution. Okay, you could kind of take money for someone to engage in bestiality with your dog. Or you could hire a prostitute to have relations with your dog. Okay, again, why you would do this, I'm gonna not for this discussion, but if someone were to do that, that's not considered znut, basically. That's what they're basically saying here. Because an etnan kelev is not forbidden to bring. The cost of that, because prostitution with a dog is not, right, relations with a dog is not considered znut. That's basically what we're saying. And the mechir zonah would be if you sold a prostitute. Meaning not you sold her for her services, but I guess you sold her as a person, like as a slave or something, or that would be permitted. So in any case, you see that relations with an animal, bestiality is not znut, because if it was, it would be forbidden as well. Last part for today. Tanu Rabbanan. Anusat atzmo u'mefutat atzmo lo yisa. A kohen gadol can't marry a rape victim of his, okay, or if he seduced someone and she did it willingly. Why can't he marry her? Very simply, she's no longer a betula, and she has to be a betula at the time of at least the betrothal, if not the marriage, right? That was our question we started with. But im nasan nasui, but if he married her, the marriage is valid. Okay, first of all, we'd say kiddushin toksim. What exactly means the marriage is valid? Does it mean they can stay married? Does it mean not? We'll get to that in another minute. Anusat chavero mufutat chavero lo yisa. But if she was raped by someone else or seduced by someone else, then he can't marry her because, again, kohen gadol can only be with a woman who is a virgin, and this woman is no longer a virgin. V'im nasa, and if he did marry her, well, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov omer havlad halal, chachamim omrim havlad kasher. There's a debate about whether the child's a halal or not. We're going to get to this more down the road tomorrow to see what exactly is the machloket based on. But right now, after they quote the braita, they want to go back and understand im nasa nasui. If you married her, they can stay married. Amar Rav Huna Amarav umotzi beget. Don't think they can stay married. It doesn't mean if they got married, they can stay married. No, it means he's supposed to divorce her with a get. But it says if he married her, it's okay. What do we do with that? Amar Rav Yaakov lomar she'em mishalem knas b'mefuteh. Has this ramification. And we talked about how you have to pay a knas when you rape a woman, and then you're also supposed to marry her. If you seduce her and she was willing, you only pay a knas in the event that this knas, right, this payment you pay is only, by the way, the 50 shekel that you pay is the same, it's 200 zuz. It's the same price as a ketubah. So you don't have to pay the knas if you seduced her in the event that you marry her. So now what they want to say is in nasa nasui, it means if he married the woman he seduced, which was forbidden to him because she was already a be'ula, she's not a virgin anymore. He wasn't allowed to, but he marries her anyway. So number one, the marriage is valid and he needs to give her a get. He can't stay married to her, but since he already married her, he gets out of paying the knas, the penalty, the fine he was supposed to pay for seducing her. He doesn't have to pay, right? The fine goes to her father. He doesn't have to pay that. Because he married her. Once you marry, you don't have to pay the knas. You might say it's a little unfair to the woman, but the truth is it doesn't really matter because I said the knas is the same as the ketubah money. So once he marries her, he obviously gave her a ketubah, and then when he divorces her, he has to give her the ketubah money. So it's just he doesn't have to do double. He gets out of the knas because it's considered a valid marriage, which then exempts him from the penalty. Again, he still has to give her a ketubah, so it's not like we're leaving the woman destitute without anything, but that's how they understand this im nasa nasui. With that, we'll finish for today. We're going to continue on with this topic tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone. Chagat Tzmut Sameach. Hope you're doing something to celebrate, even if you're living abroad, and we will meet up tomorrow.